Okay, so I know you're thinking this has to be clickbait. I promise you, this is not clickbait. If you read the title, I can actually play every single one of my video games in my collection at 60 frames per second. Kind of. It's kind of true, kind of a lie. It's kind of complicated. I'm going to get into it. Okay, so obviously you might be one of those people. It's like, look, I don't want to sit through this entire video just to find out at the very end what you're doing. Hint, it has to do with the TV I'm using. Alright? Beyond that, you're going to have to watch the entire video. But here's my situation. I can play all of my Xbox Classic, 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 games, all at 60 frames per second. Now you're probably thinking, how is this possible, especially with a TV? Now some of you may be thinking, I know he has one of those TVs that can do VRR, variable refresh rate. No, I do not have that much money. And plus, those are only for specific games. Case in point, like some of the PS5 games can enable variable refresh rate that allows the TV to take some of the load, but it's only a handful. There's no automatic thing that at least I know of. There might be a feature down the road, or there might already be a feature. Since I can't use it because I don't have that kind of TV, then I don't know that much about it. I haven't done a lot of research into variable refresh rate. But my TV is the reason why I can do 60 frames per second. And why that is because it's kind of a deceiving TV. Now, this TV I have, it's now been discontinued. They don't make this model anymore, but they have similar models like it. It's an LG 43-inch 4K TV. It can do ultra high definition or UHD, and it also has HDR, so it can do high dynamic range as well. But it doesn't have every bell and whistle. Case in point, it does not have a 120 refresh rate, or 120 Hz, I believe is the proper terminology for that. I'll put it right here for you to look it up. And something that a lot of people don't know about is that TV companies lie their ass off all the time, and they can get away with it. Because what they do is, if you want a TV that has a 120 refresh rate, case in point, you got PS5, you want to play stuff at 120 frames per second, you need one of these TVs. Because these TVs are the only ones that can do it. So you want one of those, you need to be careful what you're looking for. Because unless if it says 120 Hertz, it cannot do that. But most TVs have a 120 somewhere on the box, and they will use deceptive marketing like 120 evolution picture or 120 resolution revolution, or they'll use these stupid little gimmicks that make it seem like it's 120 frames per second TV, but in reality it's not. Its top refresh rate is 60 frames per second. I bring this up because there are a couple of methods of how these companies can cheat about the 120 refresh rate. And some TVs will use 120 refresh, but it's technically not true. You only want to get something that says 120 Hertz, like this right here. And so this TV had that same deceptive thing, and I wasn't tricked by it. I knew it didn't have a real 120 refresh rate because I was on a budget and I got this TV for $200, which 43-inch, 4K, high dynamic range, great deal. Even though you're not getting that 120 refresh rate, pretty decent deal. But I discovered something pretty cool. So, a lot of these companies, when they have the fake 120 refresh rates, they will utilize a process that is very deceptive, but also it does give you something. So, case in point, they can't just say they have a 120 refresh rate and then not give you anything. They have to give you something. And what they do is kind of interesting. So a real TV that has a 120 refresh rate, how it works, this is how it was explained to me, is every second there are 120 frames in each second. And it creates this very smooth experience. But what this TV does, and what a lot of these other TVs do with the fake 120 refresh rate, is they will have a second that has 60 frames in it. You know, the best they can do. And instead of, you know, adding in more space for 120 frames, what these TVs will do if you turn on this feature is they will put a black image in between every frame within that second. Now you're probably thinking, okay, so I'm just going to get a flickering effect and I, you know, am not going to be able to enjoy the picture. Well, no. These little black images in between each frame are so tiny that it is very hard, it is almost impossible for the naked eye to see. And so when the mind starts seeing those 60 images go by in a second, but sees those black images in between every one, it confuses your brain and it makes the image look more slick, more smooth, and creates this deceptive 120 frames per second type quality with the image. And I know some people don't like that with movies. I actually like the look of that with movies, especially like really big action movies like The Avengers. Watching The Avengers running at like that smooth 120 frames per second is really slick. Now, this leads to gaming. So, case in point, let's say you have God of War, or you have, you know, Dead Space 2, Layer, Metal Gear Solid 4. These games typically never ran at 60 frames per second, but because this feature, when you turn this feature on, it smooths out the image so that it makes the 30 frames per second game look like it's running a lot smoother. And therefore, it creates this optical illusion within every video game. It looks like you're playing a game that is running at 60 frames per second, even though you're technically not playing a game that's running 60 frames per second, and your game system isn't even running a game that's playing at 60 frames per second. But the TV is creating an optical illusion to make you think you're running a game at 60 frames per second. And it's really cool. I have enjoyed a lot of Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 games with this setup, because now these games that only ran at 30 frames per second, it looks like they're running at like 40 to 60 frames per second. And it is incredible. I've been having such a blast, and I've also been able to really enjoy some higher end games. Case in point, I was able to enjoy certain PS5 games, choosing the quality mode over the performance mode, and playing at the higher 4K resolution with ray tracing on, still having that optical effect playing. So it seems like I'm running a 4K game with ray tracing at 60 frames per second. And it's a very nice, smooth experience. There are a couple of caveats with this whole process though. One, turning on this smooth filter thing on the TV does diminish the image quality a little bit. There's a lot of tech experts on YouTube talking about you want to turn that off on your TV right away. And look, if you're looking for the best picture, then yeah, you might want to turn that off. I haven't noticed a huge difference between having it on and having it off in terms of image quality with this TV, so I never felt the need to turn it off. That being said, this process is not perfect. This throwing in a black frame in between every single frame is not perfect. There's a couple of caveats with it. One, you're not going to be able to play PS5 and Xbox Series X games at 120 frames per second. You're not going to be able to achieve that. It can't be done on at least this TV, but other TVs like it. So that's something worth keeping in mind. And you're probably thinking, well, I'll just get 120 frame per second TV and then I'll have the best of both worlds. Well, no. TVs that can run at 120 frames per second, so a lot of them, it's only for applicable things that can run in 120 frames per second. If the original thing never ran at 120 frames per second, you can't force it on. Typically, every TV is different. You might find one that can. So it's like, do you want to play every game at like a fake 60 frames per second, or do you want to be able to hit that 120 frames per second on some of those next gen games? It kind of depends on what kind of gamer you are. If you have nothing but older consoles like Sega Genesis, 360, PS3, you're going to want a TV like this. If you're into next gen consoles, you might want to look for that TV, understanding that you're not going to be able to do this little trick that I've been doing with all my games. And it wasn't even like I went out of my way to do this trick. I just kind of stumbled on this and it was a happy coincidence. But there is another thing worth knowing about this setup. It's not perfect with everything. There's a couple of things that it just cannot handle. Case in point, extremely fast moving objects. Now you're probably thinking, big red flag there. I'm not talking about a guy swinging his arm with a sword trying to cut someone. I'm talking about something even faster. Like, perfect example is the scene from Transformers Dark of the Moon, which I cannot show you actual example of my TV doing this with anything because I don't have the ability to record what my TV is showing. But with Transformers Dark of the Moon, one of the most famous scenes in that movie is the scene of the wingsuit divers jumping out of the plane and wingsuiting through the skyscrapers of Chicago. It's an exhilarating scene, and I watched the entire movie on this TV, and every other scene is incredible on this smooth motion screen except for that scene, because anytime one of those skydivers went past the building, the screen could not differentiate his arms from the building behind him, and so it just looked like he started fluttering his arms insanely quick like a bug, and it was the funniest looking thing ever, but it also tore me out of the movie experience. And just, this TV cannot handle extremely fast moving objects, and I mean extremely fast. Someone throwing a kick or a punch, or sometimes even a car driving, I never noticed a huge problem with those types of fast moving objects. But something like a person flying through the sky or a jet, that is way too fast for this TV. You're gonna have to turn off that smooth filter then, or that smoothing feature then, because you're not gonna have a good time with that. And there's a couple of games that don't quite work with this. Like, case in point, I noticed some screen tearing and artifacts in games like Star Wars Battlefront 2 when you're spinning around the characters in the character selection screen. You start seeing like kind of like tiny little glitches around the edges of them as you're moving around faster and faster. That's kind of too fast. A better example is the Xbox 360 version of Far Cry 3. Now, first things first, that version of the game is terrible. It is buggy as hell. It has so many graphical inconsistencies, such screen tearing, and that's even on an Xbox One. So if you want to play that game, I would get the Far Cry 3 Classic Edition because it has none of those problems. But with the smooth filter on, you're seeing this terrible screen chop. And yeah, you're moving smoother, but looking around, it just takes you out of experience, seeing the entire jungle like cut in half for a brief second. And when you turn it off, that problem doesn't remain, but you look very sluggish because you're only running at like 22 frames per second. And so there's a couple of games it doesn't quite work with. Most of my games, though, it's been working great with. And then one more thing worth noting is, yes, the 30 frames per second games get bumped up to like, I would say like the illusion of like 50 to 55 frames per second. But when you try a game like Call of Duty, it doesn't feel like it's running at 120 frames per second, at least with my eye. It only feels like it's running at like 70 frames per second. And when you turn it off, you can see a difference, but it's far more subtle than the difference between like a 360 30 frames per second game feeling like it's running at 60 frames per second. So anyway, that's how I've been able to play all my games at 60 frames per second. Technically not really, but also kind of. And so anyway, I just kind of thought it'd be worth pointing that out. Something you might want to look for if you're not into next gen gaming at all, but you do like your older systems, you might want to try and get one of these TVs then. If you're looking for a Series X or PS5, then maybe you might want to get a better TV, maybe one of those Sony TVs. I don't know. But so anyway, that's been how I've been able to play all my video games at 60 frames per second. Do you guys have any interesting tips and tricks you do to improve your video gaming experience? Let me know in the comments down below. Please don't forget to, do the thing. It really helps out. I'm stuck at the same subscriber count for a long time now. It really helps out. Please, thank you. My name's Chris with 11 Hour Reviews, and that will be all.